Hello, and thank you for choosing this clean historical Western romance by Emma Ashwood. Before we begin, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Your support allows us to keep sharing more wonderful stories for free. So grab a cozy spot, kick back, and let this story whisk you away to a different time and place. Enjoy. Copyright Emma Ashwood. Poppy on the Prairie by Emma Ashwood. Chapter 1. Poppy Cooper rapped sharply on the shiny door knocker for a full 5 seconds. She waited barely 10 seconds before she did the same again. This time she knocked harder and longer. Finally, she heard the shuffling of feet behind the imposing black door. It creaked open, and the face of Bessie Clark appeared. Bessie looked half asleep as if she'd been napping during the afternoon. It wouldn't surprise Poppy. The woman was lazy and would no doubt take advantage of the empty house. Bessie looked stunned to see Poppy standing there. It wasn't surprising, considering the circumstances. Poppy took one step towards her, paused for a moment, and slapped her squarely across the face. Bessie's shocked expression widened even more, and she slowly brought her hand up to her cheek where she'd been struck. She looked at Poppy as though she wasn't really sure that she had just done that. "That was for my mother. She would have been ashamed of what you've become," Poppy hissed at her. "How you could be a part of this, I have no idea. Now, if you don't move, you'll get the same again." Bessie was too stunned to speak and moved her considerable bulk a pace backward, allowing Poppy room to enter the house. Poppy didn't hesitate. She ran up the stairs, hitching up her dress as she did so. She glided swiftly around the landing and ran up the next set of stairs to her small attic room. She had lived here for the best part of 10 years, the vast majority of which had been in absolute misery. Bessie had been a considerable contributor to that misery. She didn't feel guilty in the slightest at what she had just done. She didn't dally. She pulled her few dresses out of the wardrobe and stuffed them into the carpet bag she kept under her bed. She retrieved her underwear and nightdress. She threw in a comb, her brush, and a few essentials, and gently placed a treasured photograph of her parents on top of the pile of clothes. Then she opened the bottom drawer, felt around the back of it, and pulled out a small stack of papers tied with a little red ribbon. She put them into the bag as well. She took one last glance around the room. She wouldn't be sorry to never see it again. She turned and ran back the way she had come. She half expected the formidable housekeeper to be standing at the bottom of the stairs, armed with a kitchen knife or worse. Fortunately, there was no sign of her. She didn't linger any longer. She opened the door and ran outside. Many people stopped to stare. She wasn't overly surprised. It wasn't every day in New York City that the residents got to see a young woman with bright red hair running down the streets in a wedding dress. She didn't have time to change out of the dress. That would have been a mistake. She would do so on the train when she was safe. The only thing that mattered at the moment was escaping New York City and the clutches of her aunt and uncle. She expected to hear footsteps behind her and feel her uncle's heavy hand on her shoulder, either his or the hand of the horrific Lucius Wolfe, the man her uncle had arranged for her to marry. But she reached the station without incident. This was where she knew she had to rely on luck. And for once in her life, luck seemed to be on her side. She walked up to the ticket office and pulled out the money she had diligently saved over the past year, occasionally stealing from her uncle. "I need a ticket to Montana, please," Poppy said when it was her turn at the ticket booth. The man eyed her up and down suspiciously. "You sure, miss?" he asked. "Shouldn't you be somewhere else?" "A ticket to Montana, please. When does the train leave?" she pressed, ignoring the comment. Poppy knew perfectly well there might not even be a train today. It might leave on Wednesday for all she knew. If that was the case, she would have to book herself into a hotel, a cheap one, and keep out of sight for a few days. But today of all days, Poppy was lucky. "It leaves in half an hour," the man in the ticket booth said. Her shoulders sagged in relief at the news. "Second class, please," she said. She slid over her money, and the man gave her a ticket in exchange. "Platform 2, he said in a matter-of-fact voice. She looked at the receipt in wonder for a few moments, knowing it was her ticket to freedom. "Thank you," replied Poppy, immediately turning and heading for platform 2. She took another worried glance around, but she saw no one looking for a red-headed runaway bride. On the platform, the conductor gave her a strange look. Again, she ignored it as he checked her ticket. She would be glad to get out of the wedding dress. It drew rather too much unwanted attention. As she walked down the length of the platform, she felt the eyes of the people on the train staring at her through the windows. Let them look, she thought. It would give them something to talk about on the long journey. They could make up stories together with their traveling companions about how she came to be there. But she knew that whatever stories they came up with, they wouldn't be as strange as the reality. As she got further along the train towards the engine at the front, the number of people on board seemed to get less and less. People clearly didn't want to walk very far down the platform. She finally found an empty compartment in the final carriage before third class. In the absence of a porter, she opened the door herself, flung her carpet bag inside, and took a look around. She collapsed, exhausted, onto the seat. Poppy glanced down at her hands and saw that they were shaking. She wasn't surprised. She was surprised she had managed to hold it together this long. What a day it had been. She sat nervously as the minutes ticked by, expecting all the while to see either her uncle or Lucia Wolfe appear at the window. Then they would throw open the door, drag her off the train, and take her back to the church. But before long, she heard the sharp shrill of a whistle followed by a low reply from the train engine, and the carriages started to move off. Slowly at first, a man could still run and catch up with it, but it gathered pace, moving quicker and quicker the further it got from the station. Then the platform was gone. She escaped New York City and her scheming and vile aunt and uncle. What a way to spend one's 21st birthday. She put her head in her hands and started to cry. Chapter 2. 11 years earlier. Poppy woke to the acrid smell of smoke in her nostrils. It was strange, since she had been dreaming about birthday cakes. She had been about to blow out the candles on her birthday cake, assuming the smell to be from those. But it wasn't. The smell was real, and it was here in her bedroom. She started to cough and splutter as her breath drew in the foul-tasting smoke. Today was her 11th birthday, and she was due to have a small celebration party with some of her friends from school. She had been in the middle of a very pleasant dream, where it was the most magical birthday party a young lady had ever had. She had seen the faces of all her friends and the ever-loving presence of her parents smiling warmly as they watched their only daughter enjoy her celebrations. But now she was awake and back to the reality of life. Even though she was only 11 years old, she knew there was trouble. Smoke only meant one thing: fire. She shook the sleep from her eyes and sat up. "Daddy," she shouted, but the word caught in her throat and she ended up coughing and spluttering once more. She jumped out of bed and slipped her feet into the slippers that were waiting just where her mother had left them after telling her a story about a beautiful princess the night before. She walked in the direction of her bedroom door, but she couldn't see it, not because it was nighttime, but because the smoke was so thick. She instinctively pulled her nightdress up to cover her nose and mouth. The makeshift mask offered her a small level of protection. She found the door and opened it, hoping that the smoke would be less intense outside of her room. But the landing was even worse. She saw a flickering orange light down the stairs. It was almost mesmerizing to watch the flames dance, but she managed to pull herself back to the task at hand. The house was on fire. She had to warn her parents. She stumbled in the direction of their bedroom as the smoke simply grew thicker and more intense. She coughed and then coughed some more. She began to feel lightheaded. Then she became disoriented. She spun around and shouted blindly for her parents once more, but she knew perfectly well that the sound was nothing more than a croak. In her confusion, she tripped over something and fell with a heavy crash. Pain shot through her knee. But she knew that was the least of her problems. She tried to get up, but the wooziness in her head got worse. She felt as if she was spinning and spiraling down a rabbit warren in the fields. Would she end up in Wonderland? Then she remembered nothing more. When her eyes eventually opened, she found herself in a large, brightly lit room with a distinct hum of activity all about her. It took a while for her to fathom where she was. It was a hospital ward. She saw nurses walking about, tending to patients with kind, caring hands. Why am I here? She questioned herself. Where are my parents? She sat up in the bed, fear suddenly washing over her. Where were her parents? Had they managed to escape the fire? A pretty young nurse approached and smiled at the young child. You're awake. My parents, where are they? Poppy asked. Speaking the words hurt her throat. She realized with a shock how intensely it stung and instinctively brought a hand up to her neck. Your throat will be sore for a while, the nurse said. It's the smoke that does it. It will get better. My parents, Poppy asked again. A somber expression came over the nurse's kind face, but she still didn't answer the question. Your aunt and uncle are here. I'll tell them that you're awake. A cold shiver ran down Poppy Cooper's spine. The somber expression on the nurse's face told her everything she needed to know. She may be a child, but she understood the reasons adults avoided answering uncomfortable questions. Despite knowing the truth in her heart, Poppy still burst into floods of tears when her aunt told her that her parents had died in the fire. Hush now, her aunt cooed, patting the girl on her arm. That will do no good. You will come and live with us now. Her uncle was behind her aunt and let out a snort of derision. Well, there had better be provision made for the child. Poppy's aunt looked at him. Your brother will almost certainly have put that in place, Bryce. You know how diligent he was. She gave him a slight smile, and Bryce nodded in understanding. True, but the child better be no trouble. Look at her, her aunt said, turning back to Poppy. She looks an absolute angel. She'll be no trouble at all. Stop crying, Bryce demanded matter-of-factly. Poppy tried her best, but if anything, the crying only got worse. It's the shock. She'll be perfectly fine. She's our responsibility now, Jane Copper replied to her husband. He took a step closer to her and smiled warmly at Poppy. You'll come and live with us, Poppy. We'll look after you. We're the only family you have now. But seeing the older woman looking down at her in the hospital bed, a poor, helpless girl, Poppy couldn't help but feel that she wasn't really smiling at her. Poppy was right. Jane Cooper was smiling at the thought of her husband's dead brother's bank accounts. Chapter 3. 10 years later. Poppy Cooper had just turned 20 years old, but like every other birthday, it wasn't celebrated in her aunt and uncle's household. The day passed just like any other, usually in misery for Poppy. She stared at the photograph of her parents, burnt around the edges, but still showing their faces as though they were still alive. It was the only thing that had not been destroyed in the fire. Somehow it had managed to escape on the winds. Looking at the image of her parents on their wedding day, she couldn't help but see how much she now looked like her mother. She had her face, but strangely, she thought she had her father's eyes. But not for the first time. She wished she had died with them in that horrific fire all those years ago. She wished that she was with them again. All she wanted was comfort from her mother, or a reassuring word from her father. Her aunt and uncle offered her none of that. When she moved into their home, she was shocked at the differences. She was shoved into a small, dirty attic room with just a rickety wooden bed and a wardrobe that was missing one of its doors. It wasn't that their home wasn't comfortable. It was just that she didn't seem to be allowed to enjoy any of it. There were no bedtime stories. There was no fun or games. It soon became obvious to Poppy that she wasn't really wanted. She often wondered during those early years of living with them why her aunt and uncle had agreed to take her in. But as she grew older and learned to listen carefully to the whisperings between the pair, she gathered it was all to do with money. Don't be so stupid, her aunt snapped at her when Poppy had once questioned what had happened to her parents' money. Your father's businesses were all in debt. Everything went to paying people off. We look after you out of the goodness of our hearts. Poppy knew perfectly well that she was lying. Although her aunt and uncle never moved house, the furnishings within it seemed to miraculously improve after Poppy moved in. Her aunt's wardrobe suddenly expanded. At the time, she didn't question this. She didn't question how her uncle, a tailor, soon gave up that business and became a gentleman of leisure almost overnight. She was, after all, but a child. These thoughts simply didn't cross her mind. But now that she had reached 20, she understood that her aunt and uncle were more than likely using the money her parents had provided in their will for her care to lavish on themselves. She couldn't prove it, of course, and she couldn't speak to them about it or tell anyone her concerns. Poppy didn't particularly care about the money. That wasn't her nature. She just wished that her aunt and uncle would show her some love and affection, but they never did. When her Aunt Jane had a child of her own, a daughter by the name of Scarlet, matters got worse. Poppy was almost relegated to the role of servant. Not formally, of course. That would never do. Only when her aunt and uncle entertained guests at the house were they nice to her. She would have to sit with them and play the role of the perfect niece, that make polite conversation with the guests and tell them how wonderfully her aunt and uncle looked after her. She was always threatened before the guests arrived, and again once they left. Poppy had received beatings from her aunt in the past and was never keen to experience another. She always did exactly as she was told. But even then, it wasn't enough to keep the beatings at bay. Her aunt and uncle had also taken on the services of her mother's housekeeper, Bessie Clark, having apparently not employed one previously. In the early months and years after her parents' passing, Bessie had been the only one to show Poppy an ounce of love and care. She sympathized with the child. But as the years progressed, the housekeeper turned into a mirror image of her aunt. Poppy was often sent to the kitchens to help her, and Bessie ensured the girl took on all the arduous work while she did next to nothing. If Poppy made a mistake, Bessie would beat her. When Poppy raised a complaint with her aunt regarding her treatment at the hands of the housekeeper, she got a second beating from her as well, with the refrain, "No doubt you deserved it, you ungrateful child." The words ungrateful child were used often in her aunt and uncle's household. Apparently, she was meant to be full of gratitude for the meager scraps they would give her at mealtimes and the almost threadbare rags she would usually wear around the house. She had 2 decent dresses, one for church and one for receiving guests. All her others were a disgrace. She had seen better on the slum women in 5 Points. As Scarlett grew older, she became almost as insufferable as her parents. She would order Poppy around as though she were her personal servant. When Poppy objected, once again her aunt would beat her, telling her that she would do precisely what Scarlett demanded. There was something very improper about a 15-year-old girl being ordered about by a 3-year-old. She began to wonder as she approached her 21st birthday whether she would ever be able to escape the clutches of her aunt and uncle. Marriage might be one way out. She knew she had developed into a beautiful young woman. Men would often stare at her when she was out. Admiring glances became a way of life. Of course, she was warned repeatedly by both her aunt and uncle not to speak to men. She rarely went out without one or both adults chaperoning her, so there was little opportunity. One of her tasks, however, was to collect the mail each morning. As she walked to collect it, she would pass a newsstand on the way. The man who ran it would always give her a cheery word and a wave. Poppy would reply in kind. Once this became the norm, she would stop for a chat with him. He was an older man, probably nearing 60, with a long gray and white beard and the odor of tobacco. His name was Pat Connolly, and he had come over to the country from Ireland 35 years before. She did not feel threatened by him, nor did she ever suspect that he was taking an unhealthy interest in her. She began to look at Pat as a kind of surrogate grandfather. As their little friendship grew, he asked her when she might be getting married. Poppy shook her head and said she had no idea. That would be up to her uncle. Then one day, on instinct, the shopkeeper handed her a rolled-up newspaper. She had been badly beaten by her aunt 2 days earlier, and despite trying to disguise it with the makeup she was now permitted, the left side of her face still showed signs of bruising. "Take a look at that when you are alone later," Pat said softly. She started to unroll the newspaper, but he stopped her. "Later," he insisted. "Keep it hidden until then." She did exactly as he said. Later that night, She pulled the newspaper from where she had kept it hidden inside her dress and was surprised to find that it was a publication named the Matrimonial Times. It seemed to contain advertisements from gentlemen out west seeking young women to become their brides. There was a page of text within the newspaper that explained that there were so few women out west that men were taking out advertisements for suitable women all along the East Coast to become their brides. There were 3 stories about how different women achieved happiness and love by responding to these advertisements. She began reading through them. Advertisements posted by miners, ranchers, gold prospectors, businessmen, lawyers, and even sheriffs, all seeking brides. Poppy found it a strange way for people to find love. She dismissed the idea completely, wondering why the vendor had given it to her. It wasn't her who would decide if she got married or not. It would be her uncle. She rather feared that this wouldn't happen, since her aunt and uncle would surely not be free to use the money intended for her care for their own benefit once she was married. She almost threw the newspaper away, but for some reason, she rolled it up and put it in her bottom drawer. A few years ago, the furniture in her attic room had been upgraded. She now had a fully functioning wardrobe, a higher quality bed, a set of drawers, and a dressing table. Her uncle had bemoaned the expense, but her aunt insisted it would be worth it as she approached her 21st birthday. After she had turned 20, the fact that Poppy would soon be 21 was often spoken about in hushed conversations. Her aunt and uncle would exchange sly glances, and it was clear to her that they were up to something. The question was what? Chapter 4. It soon became clear that the matter of marriage had her aunt and uncle scheming. Her marriage. Unusually, a string of gentlemen guests was paraded through the house over a period. These were men she had hardly encountered in her life before then. There was the occasional one whom she might have seen amongst the church congregation, but they had never visited the home in any capacity previously. However, Poppy was instructed to attend the meetings with her aunt and uncle in her uncle's study. There, they would drink tea and nibble on cakes that she had baked herself the previous evening. Bessie was, of course, the one who was meant to bake them, but these days she did almost next to nothing. To save herself from beatings, Poppy took the work on. These meetings often seemed like informal chats. Her aunt and uncle's guests would talk about everything and nothing, the weather and the price of bread and the mistakes the president was making. But all the time, Poppy felt the men's eyes on her. Some made it more obvious than others. Some looked her up and down with an expression on their faces that sent a cold shiver down her spine. She dreaded to think what might be going on in their minds. Others were slightly more subtle about it, offering warm smiles and polite compliments. But all of the men had 2 things in common. Firstly, they were all at least twice her age. And secondly, all were very obviously very wealthy. The very first meeting took place the week after Pat gave her the copy of the Matrimonial Times. After just 3 such meetings and the slow realization of what her aunt and uncle were planning, Poppy pulled the paper from its hiding place in her bottom drawer. She began to scour the advertisements once more. One in particular stood out to her. It was placed by a rancher in Montana by the name of Hunter Harrison, who had just inherited the family ranch and was now looking for a wife to help him run it, with whom to start a family of his own. He said he was 28 years of age and of reasonable looks. He simply hadn't looked for a wife before because of a lack of time. The advertisement made it clear that he needed a wife who wasn't afraid of hard work. Somehow, Poppy imagined him to be a tall, handsome, rugged cowboy. She knew perfectly well that she wasn't afraid of arduous work. Every day of her life entailed hard graft. She began to fantasize about what it might be like to be Harrison's wife. She dreamed of not being a prisoner and of not being afraid of a beating when she inadvertently offended somebody. She dreamed of being free to make her own choices in life. Twice, she sat down at the end of the day with pen and paper that she'd stolen from her uncle's study and started scratching out a response to Hunter Harrison. On both occasions, she ended up throwing her attempt in the bin. What possible hope was there, she thought? There was no way she would be able to run away and marry a rancher in Montana. Her uncle would never allow it. As she walked past Pat the day after the second failed attempt, she stopped and asked him a question. "Why did you give me a copy of that newspaper, Pat?" Pat put a gentle hand on her shoulder. "You walk past here daily, young child. So often you're bruised, and it's clear you're not happy in that home. It's clear to me that the people who are meant to look after you don't have your best interests at heart. I was just planting an idea in your mind." My younger sister headed out west to become a mail-order bride. That was 10 years ago. She went to Texas. She writes occasionally, about twice a year. She has 5 children now and a husband who adores her. You could have the same. She lay in bed that night with Pat's words echoing in her ears. You could have the same. Pat was right. She had to take a risk. Definitely, all the men her uncle had presented to her were highly unsuitable. It was almost as if he were trying to sell her to the highest bidder. She got out of bed, adjusted the small oil lamp she was permitted, and pulled out her remaining few sheets of pilfered paper. She took a deep breath and wrote a reply to Hunter Harrison. It was difficult to write. She didn't have much practice these days. Her aunt and uncle had put a stop to her schooling 6 months after taking her in. It was probably about the same time that the fees her parents had paid in advance ran out. The only thing she seemed to write these days was lists of tasks that she needed to complete around the house. But finally, she managed to construct a credible and worthwhile response to his advertisement. She knew that Hunter would probably have had a considerable number of replies, and that she was also responding very late. But for some reason, she felt hope bloom in her heart. The next day, she mailed her letter along with her aunt and uncle's correspondence. She realized her uncle might not find out about any correspondence she received because she was the one who collected it from the post office. She was sure it wouldn't cross either her aunt or uncle's mind that she would receive any correspondence at all. After all, who would write to a poor, unknown orphan girl? All she had to do was hide any letters she received until she was free to read them when she was alone in her bedroom. After mailing the letter, she walked back home past Pat's newsstand. "I did it," she whispered in his ear. "I've written to a man in Montana." His face broke out into a wide smile. "I knew you had it in you, girl. I hope things work out for you. If you need any help, you just ask." "I think you've helped enough, Pat. But that's truly kind of you. If I need anything, I will ask." That night, at home in her attic room as she fell asleep, she began dreaming of the prairie and of what life might be like in Montana. Chapter 5. By the time Lucius Wolfe visited Poppy and her aunt and uncle for the second time, she had almost forgotten about her letter to Hunter Harrison. Almost 2 months had passed since she had written, and she had all but forgotten about the man and Montana. Clearly, she was too late in responding, or perhaps he simply wasn't interested in her. She considered asking Pat for the latest copy of the Matrimonial Times so that she could seek out a new potential husband with whom to correspond. However, she didn't want to rob Pat him of any income he might garner from selling the newspaper. Times were hard for many people at the moment. Pat had helped her enough already by giving her the idea. She had been told the previous evening to present herself at 2 that afternoon in her uncle's study. Her uncle's friend, Lucius Wolfe, would be returning for another visit. She remembered Lucius Wolfe from his first visit. The man must have been 55 if he was a day. He wore a red waistcoat with buttons that had incredible tenacity to manage to restrain the man's voluminous stomach. He was one of those men who sent a cold shiver down her spine. She recalled that he had looked her up and down almost as if he were assessing cattle at a market. Lucius Wolfe was probably the least appealing to her of all the potential suitors her uncle had forced her to meet. Not that that was saying much. All were equally poor options. She spent the evening making her little cakes and had now perfected baking them to be light and fluffy. She recalled how Lucius had managed to consume 4 during his previous visit. He'd also demanded a tumbler of whiskey to accompany the 4 token sips of tea he managed to consume. 1 whiskey had quickly turned into 2. His red, inflamed nose told Poppy that glasses of whiskey in the afternoon were not uncommon. That morning, she walked to the post office as usual and collected her aunt and uncle's mail. She thanked the man behind the counter, and as she walked out, absent-mindedly flicked through the pile of about 15 letters. Suddenly, she froze. There was a letter for her. Poppy Cooper was emblazoned on the envelope in an elegant script. She turned it over to see the return address. White Gates Ranch, Glendive, Montana. It was from Hunter. He'd replied. She wanted to rip the envelope open and consume the contents of the letter there and then, but it was raining. She didn't want it to get ruined with runny ink. Instead, she hid it in the depths of her dress and hurried home. "Where have you been?" her uncle demanded as she walked through the door. "You must look presentable when Lucius calls this afternoon." Her uncle was assessing her disheveled appearance and wet hair. "Of course, sir," Poppy replied, addressing him with the formality that had become usual between her and her guardians. Sir and madam were now the standard forms of address. "I was just collecting your correspondence from the post office." She handed over the pile of letters. Her uncle began flicking through them and seemed to forget all about chastising his niece. "I will be ready for 2 o'clock," she reassured him. "Make sure you are. Take some time with your appearance. Lucius is an important man," he growled as he left her. Poppy smiled to herself. Her uncle had essentially given her permission to go to her bedroom. She did just that. She practically ran up the stairs. But instead of getting ready, she carefully opened the envelope, gently touching the letter with her fingers as she did so. "Dear Poppy, I was beginning to think that no one would ever reply to my advertisement. However, with a reply such as yours, one response was all I ever needed. I was sorry to read of your grievous loss as a child. I trust your aunt and uncle treat you well. I cannot possibly imagine what life must be like in New York City. I was born and raised here on the Prairie, and I have to confess I have no desire to ever leave it. I will be blunt and to the point. Life on the ranch is hard. Anyone contemplating a life here must accept that immediately. However, it is not without its rewards. The sunsets are nothing short of magical. The mountains in the distance mesmerize the mind. It is the perfect place in which to raise children. I wish I were better with words to express how deeply I long for a wife with whom to share all my worldly gifts. But I am but a simple rancher who received only a basic schooling. I confess I have little idea what to write in such letters, other than to mention the fact that I am a lonely rancher. I suppose I should tell you a little about myself. I am of medium height, and people describe my complexion as fair. My mother, bless her departed soul, would always say that women would find me pleasing, but that is not for me to judge. I would be delighted to learn more about you at your earliest possible convenience. Yours, Hunter Harrison. Poppy read the letter over and over at least 5 or 6 times. She smiled at the mixture of formality and vulnerability that came across. She almost giggled when she read the line about her aunt and uncle treating her well. But the line that stood out the most to her was the one about a lonely rancher. She suddenly realized that she was lonely as well. She wanted nothing more than someone with whom to share her life, someone to talk to at the end of the day, as opposed to going to bed and crying herself to sleep. Suddenly, she heard footsteps on the stairs. Very quickly, she folded the sheets of paper, leaped off the bed, and hid them in the bottom drawer. She slipped off her dress and was seated in just her undergarments at the dressing table. Her aunt entered the room without knocking. "Good," she almost barked after quickly assessing the situation. "You are making yourself look presentable." She took 2 steps forward and then almost whispered under her breath, "The meeting this afternoon is to go well. Do you understand?" Poppy turned to look at her aunt. "Yes, madam, I understand. It will go well." Her aunt looked her up and down. "There may be other meetings with Lucius Wolfe. We may need to get you another dress, something a little tighter fitting." Again, her aunt seemed to be assessing her near-naked body, and that made her feel nothing but uncomfortable. "But that will be for another time. Make sure you smile a lot this afternoon, you ungrateful child. Do not sit there with that almost permanent scowl on your face." "Yes, madam?" Poppy agreed and turned her attention back to her makeup. Each month, Poppy was given a small sum of money to spend on makeup. Firstly, Poppy thought that this was for her own benefit, but of course, she now realized this was to make her look prettier for the potential husbands. Her aunt turned and left the bedroom without speaking another word. Poppy's heart sank at the news that there might be further visits from this man. She rather feared that this meant Lucius Wolfe was the man her uncle had chosen for her to marry. Chapter 6. Lucius Wolfe managed to consume 3 glasses of whiskey on this particular visit. With every glass, he consumed one of Poppy's cakes. He did at least have the good grace to compliment them. The conversation was as benign as it was on the previous visit. Uncle Bryce and Lucius broke into a conversation about the ups and downs of the stock market. Poppy could tell by her aunt's glazed expression that she was following the conversation as poorly as Poppy. Poppy managed to stifle a yawn while she nibbled on a cake. Finally, Lucius Wolfe slurred his farewells, only this time he approached Poppy, grabbed her hand, and kissed it softly. "I hope to see you again soon, Miss Poppy." "It would be my pleasure," Poppy replied, taking in the pointed glares from her aunt and uncle, who were standing behind Lucius. He gave her a sickening smile and looked her up and down again in a most disconcerting manner. He turned, and when he did so, Poppy carefully wiped the back of her hand on the back of her dress. His lips were cold, and the kiss was wet. Her stomach almost heaved thinking about it. She couldn't possibly marry this man. The thought of him pawing at her was repulsive. She closed her eyes and instead conjured up the picture of Hunter Harrison she had dreamed up in her mind. Having Hunter kiss her hand would be a far different experience, she was sure. Lucius left, and her aunt and uncle seemed to be in a most excitable mood. They whispered to one another while Poppy began to clear the cups and saucers. "You need to make him sign," her aunt said under her breath. "All in good time." "We need to get the best terms possible," her uncle replied. They became aware of Poppy's presence and suddenly stopped talking. They glared at their niece. "Get this plate cleared away then, girl," Jane demanded. "I won't have you in this house being idle. How many times do I have to tell you?" "Yes, madam. Sorry, madam," Poppy replied almost without thought. She was always ready with the correct and humble response when chastised. One thing had now changed for the better. She knew perfectly well that her aunt wouldn't hit her. Since the visits from the men had started, she hadn't endured a single beating. She knew the reason was simple. Her aunt and uncle didn't want her looks hampered by unsightly bruises. Now she wanted nothing more than to retire to her room to write Hunter a response to his letter. But that was impossible. She was only permitted to slip upstairs to change out of her good dress into her workwear. Bessie then kept her busy until late into the evening. Finally, she was dismissed, and despite the weariness in her bones, Poppy refused to go to bed. Instead, she sat at her dressing table, pulled out the sheets of paper she'd stolen from her uncle's study, and crafted a response. "Dear Hunter, I was delighted to receive your letter this morning. I was beginning to fear that you would not respond. I thank you for your kind comments regarding the loss of my parents. I hope that you go through the grieving process quickly. I know that the loss of a parent can be hard, no matter how old the child. I feel that we have many similarities. We are both now without our parents, and just like you, I often feel lonely. I regret to say that my aunt and uncle do not treat me well. I'm considered nothing more than a servant, and I fear that my uncle is plotting to sell me as a bride to one of his business associates." Poppy's pen hovered over the page. She almost scratched the last paragraph out. Might it reek of desperation? Might Hunter think she was only corresponding with him as a possible means of escape? "I want to assure you that I write to you not in desperation or in search of my savior, but in a genuine search for a like-minded husband with whom I can build a life. The way you describe Montana is nothing short of magical. I have never been beyond New York City, but the thought of mountains fills me with wonder. I hope one day to see the sunset with you at my side." Once again, Poppy hesitated and almost scratched out her words. Maybe that would seem too forward. Then she laughed. This whole idea seemed ludicrous. Who was she to judge if she was being forward or not? Instead, She continued with her response. I am not a skilled writer, but I hope my letters afford you a certain degree of warmth. I believe I may have neglected to mention in my first letter that I am approaching my 21st birthday in a few months. I have long red hair, and although I hesitate to say it for fear it may seem arrogant, I do believe that men find me attractive. When you write again, will you tell me more about life in Montana? The way you describe it in your letters sounds almost magical. Yours, Poppy Cooper. She paused for a moment before correcting the final sign-off. Yours, with affection, Poppy Cooper. Poppy read it over 3 times and finally decided she was happy with it. She folded it carefully and placed it in an envelope. She addressed it and placed it underneath her pillow for safekeeping. The next day, she woke up early and headed out to the post office as soon as it opened. She mailed her latest letter, kissing the envelope lightly before she entered the post office. On her return home, she headed past Pat's newsstand. She brought him up to date with all that had happened. He replied. Hunter responded. Pat laughed. Of course he did. I didn't doubt it for a moment. Poppy frowned. She had a question that had been playing on her mind. I don't understand what the procedure is with this. What happens now? Pat stroked his long beard. To the best of my knowledge, my sister exchanged letters back and forth for a few months, and finally, Arthur, that's her rancher over in Texas, proposed to her in a letter. She accepted straight away, jumped on a train, and headed to him. She's never looked back since. Do you think Hunter would do the same? I can't promise anything, Poppy, but why wouldn't he? Pat's kind compliment made her smile. Of course, Pat didn't know that Lucius Wolfe was waiting in the wings. She rather feared that he was a man who wouldn't want to let her go either. Chapter 7. Poppy experienced a range of emotions over the next few months. Hunter Harrison continued their correspondence. The letters became slightly more regular, and Poppy almost got used to running to the post office every morning when she thought she might be expecting a letter. She would always take care to respond on the very evening on which she received a reply. She felt that she was beginning to know him well. She felt as if they had a true and deep connection, even if they hadn't met. It was strange that she didn't truly know what he looked like. She worried that if they did meet, he might find her appearance unappealing. But she told herself that these reactions were just natural in such a strange situation. Without vanity or arrogance, she understood that she was a beautiful young woman and that it was unlikely he would find her unappealing. However, between the highs of Hunter's letters, a significant number of lows presented in Poppy's life. Lucius Wolfe continued to visit her aunt and uncle. The vast majority of the time she was present at these meetings, however, some were held in secret. By now, it would have been obvious to anyone what was happening. Even a fool would understand that she was being put forward for marriage to the hideous Mr. Wolfe. Her aunt knew perfectly well that Poppy was no fool, and the threats had started. Your uncle will decide who you marry, Aunt Jane told her one afternoon. When he does, there will be no debate, there will be no argument. Do you understand me, girl? Yes, madam, Poppy replied, her heart sinking. When might that be? Her aunt's face screwed up. She stood up and raised her hand. For a brief moment, Poppy prepared herself for yet another beating, but her aunt regained her composure, understanding that she must not mar her prized asset. It will be when your uncle determines it will be, you ungrateful little wretch. Do you know, I curse the day you walked over this threshold, child. You have been nothing but trouble since the day you arrived. Yes, madam. Sorry, madam, Poppy replied in her usual manner. She kept her head down and waited until she was dismissed. The sooner the better, in my mind, Aunt Jane said. I understand, madam. I am grateful for all you've done for me, Poppy lied smoothly. What was the point of creating a situation with the woman? She may as well try to please her. Keep her aunt and uncle thinking she was already resigned to her fate. It would keep them off guard. She'd already conceived her plans in her mind. Of the money she was given each month to spend on makeup and other sundries, she squirreled half away in a carpet bag she managed to find in the storeroom. It was old and musty, but it would nonetheless do the job when needed. On occasion, her uncle got drunk and allowed coins to spill out on his study floor, or at his desk. She'd helped herself to one or two while she was tidying up early in the mornings. He would notice the missing coins and surmise that he had spent them at the club the previous evening. She added them to the stockpile she was building. There was no way she was going to marry Lucius Wolfe. As soon as she knew marriage was imminent, she would flee. She prayed each day that a letter would arrive from Hunter Harrison, asking her to marry him. But even if one didn't, she would still head to Montana and hopefully charm the man in person. She would not marry Wolfe, no matter what happened. Things would, of course, be less complicated and happier if that letter just arrived from Glendive. She would quietly pack her carpet bag in the middle of the night and then disappear out of the front door, on the auspices of collecting the mail as she did each morning. Only this time she would never return. At least that was her plan. 2 weeks before her 21st birthday, Lucius Wolfe once again paid a visit. This time, he was permitted to spend time alone with Poppy for a short while. Her aunt had instructed that she wear the brand new dress that had been made for her. She had to attend at least 3 fittings with the dressmaker over the previous weeks. The dress was beautiful, but it was very tight-fitting. When she put it on in front of the mirror, she knew perfectly well why her aunt had purchased it for her. It accentuated all of her womanly attributes. As soon as she was ushered into Lucius Wolfe's presence, she could feel his hungry eyes eating into her. She wanted immediately to turn and flee, but that was obviously not an option. Instead, she had to endure his lustful stares. The dress did have one advantage. It seemed to render Lucius Wolfe at a loss for words. He stuttered and stammered, but finally found himself able to speak. "I hope you've enjoyed our time together as much as I have, Miss Poppy." "Only if you've been enjoying it as much as torture," Poppy thought. "It has been most pleasant, Mr. Wolfe," Poppy replied softly in the manner expected of her. "My dear, you must call me Lucius." "I see, Lucius it is then," Poppy said with a respectful nod of her head. "I hope that we will be spending more time together soon, if you know what I mean." Regretfully, Poppy rather feared she knew what he meant. "That would indeed be most pleasant, Lucius." She felt bile rising in her stomach as she said the words. Obviously, it would be anything but. "If you are agreeable, I will speak to your uncle," Lucius Wolfe replied. "That would be wise," Poppy replied, suppressing a grin. This was a most strange conversation. Did Lucius Wolfe think that he had just proposed marriage to her? She had a sneaky suspicion that he had. "Splendid," Lucius said with a clap of his hands. "I shall go and speak to him right now, then." He stood up, and Poppy mirrored his actions. Once again, he took in her entire form, lingering on the areas that seemed to please him the most. And once again, he took her hand and pressed his cold lips against it. "I hope to soon kiss those beautiful lips of yours," he said, almost like a shy schoolboy. Poppy smiled and hung her head like a proper lady. She wanted more than anything to tell him that, if she had her way, she would never see the vile old man again. But instead, she stood her ground and waited. "Until next time, then, Miss Poppy," Lucius almost growled with lust. "Until next time, Lucius," Poppy agreed, while saying a silent prayer that Hunter Harrison would hurry up and write to her with his proposal of marriage. Chapter 8. 2 days before her 21st birthday, Poppy was ordered to the kitchen by her aunt. "In 2 days, we are to have a small gathering here in the afternoon. I wish for an elaborate cold spread to be prepared. There will be 20 people in attendance. I will leave it to you," Aunt Jane said, looking at the housekeeper. "Of course, madam, I will ensure that it's done," replied Bessie. Poppy glanced across at the housekeeper and sneered at her answer. Poppy knew perfectly well that Bessie would hardly lift a finger. It would be her doing the work. She had no doubt that nobody in the household would recall that it was her birthday on that day, and she was sure that the gathering had absolutely nothing to do with that occasion. If her parents had been alive, she was sure they would have arranged an elaborate celebration to mark the occasion. She would have had all her friends around. She might even have been married at this point to a man of her choosing. But there was no point in dreaming of what could never be. Instead, she knew perfectly well that the work would keep her out of trouble for the next few days. It would also keep her away from many meetings with Lucius Wolfe, and that had to be a positive aspect. As expected, Bessie did next to nothing in terms of physical preparations. She eased her huge bulk into her favorite chair in the kitchen and ordered Poppy about. "Did you like working for my parents?" Poppy finally asked her. "Your parents?" Bessie replied, confused by the question. "Yes, I suppose I did. Do you think they would have been pleased with how this has worked out?" Bessie shrugged her shoulders. "It doesn't really matter, does it? They're dead. I've done what I've had to do. I wasn't left any money, you know. I had to take employment where it was offered. I had to do what I had to do." "Like beat me? You had to do that? Did it make you feel good?" "If you don't get to work, I'll beat you again, no matter what Mistress Jane says," hissed Bessie. Poppy wanted to utter a smart reply, but she thought better of it and threw herself into the preparations. She wondered who would be attending the gathering to be held at the house. Maybe people from church? Or members of one of the societies that her aunt frequented on Wednesday afternoons. Maybe they were business associates of her uncle? Maybe Lucius Wolfe would attend. She would have to attend the gathering herself after she had prepared everything. She hoped not. The last thing she wanted was to watch Lucius consume plateful after plateful of food, all while feeling his hot eyes on her. It was clearly an important event because her aunt kept appearing in the kitchen to check on the preparations. Somehow, however, Aunt Jane always managed to time her visits when Bessie was actually on her feet, doing some work. Poppy could almost have screamed in frustration. She would have liked nothing more than for her aunt to walk in and see Bessie in the chair, issuing orders. Her aunt's demands grew ever more elaborate as she thought of new dish after new dish to add to the ever-growing feast. In the end, Bessie was actually forced to lend Poppy a helping hand. Finally, Poppy managed to stumble into bed a few minutes before midnight. There were no thanks for her hard work, just the promise that the work would be repeated again tomorrow. She fell asleep almost as soon as her head touched her thin pillow. Despite the tiredness and aches in her body, Poppy was awake early. She left the house before she could be dragged back down to the depths of the kitchen. She wanted to visit the post office, and she was glad that she had, because once again, there was a letter from Montana. This time, she didn't wait until she got home. She took a quick detour around the park and sat on a small wooden bench to open Hunter's letter. This was it. She could hardly believe the words that were written. "If you are willing, I would like to invite you to become my wife." This was it. The proposal that she was waiting for. This was her escape. Her heart quickened as she read the words time and time again. "If you are willing, I would like to invite you to become my wife." Hunter included money to pay for the train ticket out west. That, together with the funds she'd saved, would be more than sufficient to cover her travel costs and lodging. She'd already researched the matter. She knew the cost of a ticket and the cost of food and drink en route. She sat for a few moments longer, enjoying the warmth of the morning sun as she plotted her escape. Finally, the time had come to make her move. She would leave early in the morning, before dawn. Poppy felt it fitting that the opportunity had presented itself on her 21st birthday, as there seemed something poetic in that, somehow. Not that anybody would have known, of course. She hadn't told Hunter the date of her birth, and she knew perfectly well that her aunt and uncle wouldn't acknowledge it even if they had remembered, which she strongly doubted. Finally, she reluctantly made her way back to the house, hiding her personal letter in her dress and holding her uncle's 2 letters in her right hand. "Where on earth have you been?" her aunt asked as she walked through the front door. "Collecting the mail as normal, madam," Poppy replied truthfully, waving the 2 letters in front of her as evidence. "That could have been left for today. The food for tomorrow needs sorting. I will not be embarrassed at this event," her aunt replied. "What is the reason for the event, aunt?" Poppy finally asked, her curiosity getting the better of her. "How dare you ask such questions in my household? Who do you think you are?" Her aunt replied, shaking her head furiously. "It's simply a gathering of friends. No business or concern of yours. Now back to the kitchen. Proceed with the preparation. You can't leave Bessie to do all the work herself, the poor woman." Poppy wanted to laugh in her aunt's face. Bessie hadn't done a full day's labor in at least 7 years. She grinned to herself, knowing that by tomorrow afternoon, Bessie would suddenly realize, together with her aunt and uncle, that Poppy was missing. And when she was gone, Bessie would have to do all the work herself. Everything. She would find that a terrible shock. It was just another pleasant bonus to the fact that she was about to escape this household. But once again, it seemed that fate decided to work against Poppy Cooper. She went to bed that night, excited but tired after another hard day's work. The spread of food that her aunt demanded be prepared was nothing short of spectacular. The guests would certainly be impressed. Poppy was sorry that she wouldn't be there to eat it herself, but not so sorry that she would not prefer to think about Hunter Harrison, waiting for her arrival in Montana. She would far prefer to start her new life full of hope and joy out in the West. She was so excited at the prospect that despite the weariness, she couldn't sleep. But finally, her eyes closed in the early hours of the morning, only to find that she was being rudely shaken awake before dawn had even broken. It was her aunt ordering her out of bed. "What is it?" Poppy demanded, suddenly full of fear. "Was there another fire? Did they have to get out of the house quickly?" "Wake up, child," her aunt said in a gruff voice. "You have to get ready." "Get ready for what?" Poppy asked, full of confusion, the sleep still heavy on her mind and clouding her thoughts. "Church," Aunt Jane said gruffly. "We are to be there for the service at 10. "It's not Sunday," Poppy said stupidly, and then she saw it hanging in the doorway. A cold sweat broke out across her entire body. Her aunt must have placed it there before shaking her awake. It was a white dress. "No," her aunt said with a smile. "It's not Sunday. It's your wedding day." Chapter 9. Poppy stared at her aunt in shock. How could she have been so foolish not to see that this was the event that was planned all along? The fact that it was her 21st birthday was hugely important. She guessed that she would come into some form of inheritance on this day. The payments for her care would stop going to her aunt and uncle. She had little doubt that her uncle had managed to scheme with Lucius Wolfe to get a generous payout out of the inheritance for her hand in marriage. If she was married on her 21st birthday, her husband would effectively take control of her financial affairs, and she would have no say. She had been an idiot all along. She had been far too trusting. She should have fled to Montana when she had the chance. She had no idea how much this inheritance might be. But at the moment, that wasn't a concern in the slightest. She would walk away from $1 million if it meant that she didn't have to marry Lucius Wolfe. Aunt Jane had clearly considered that very possibility. She pulled up a chair and sat down, watching as Poppy climbed out of bed slowly and washed at the porcelain basin in the corner. "Bessie is waiting at the bottom of the stairs. The latch is firmly over the front door. Just in case," Jane said matter-of-factly. Poppy said nothing. It would be stupid to deny that she was thinking of running away. She could not argue that she was looking forward to marrying Lucius. Her aunt wouldn't buy that in the slightest. So instead, she kept her mouth shut and tried to come up with a plan as she slowly began to prepare for her wedding day. She washed her hair, combed it, and put it into a bun. She applied her makeup slowly and carefully as any self-respecting bride would do on her wedding day. Finally, she slipped on the dress. When she looked in the mirror, she couldn't help but gasp. She looked the very picture of the bride she had always hoped to be. She was like one of the princesses in the fairy stories her mother would tell her at bedtime. But today, she wouldn't be marrying a handsome prince. Instead, she would be marrying an old, fat man who had struck a deal with her vile, scheming uncle. And tonight, after the celebrations, she would travel home with Lucius Wolfe, and he would do what he had lusted after for all these weeks. It simply didn't bear thinking about. Her aunt didn't offer her a word of encouragement. She didn't say how beautiful her niece looked. Instead, she just grunted. "Good. We'll go downstairs and wait." There had to be a way out, Poppy kept telling herself. But no opportunity presented itself. A carriage arrived, and she was marched outside, her uncle leading the way, and her aunt standing closely beside her, holding her arm roughly and giving her no opportunity to escape. They sat on either side of her in the carriage, their stony expressions fixed in front of them. She couldn't even leap out of the carriage while it was moving. It was a 15-minute ride to the church, and every second of the journey was spent in silence. Poppy sensed that her aunt and uncle were just as nervous as they were excited. That got her thinking that rather a large sum of money must be riding on this union. When the carriage came to a halt, they were early, and the clock in the church tower showed it to be shortly after 9:30. It was clear that they had no intention of missing the wedding. The pastor was waiting for them and greeted them warmly. He smiled at the new bride, who stared back icily. She wondered if the pastor knew the particulars of the arrangements behind this marriage. Even if he did, she knew he wouldn't have the courage to stop it. No doubt he'd been paid a handsome fee to conduct the service. "My niece is understandably nervous on her wedding day," her uncle explained to the pastor. "Oh, I understand perfectly. All my brides tend to be nervous on their big day," the pastor said with a huge smile. "If you would like to wait in this room here," he pointed to a small doorway, "we will allow the guests sufficient time to arrive and be seated. The bridegroom, of course, will be waiting at the front, at the altar. Then I will come for you, and we will proceed with the service. It will be bad luck for any of the guests to see the bride before the ceremony." Of course, Uncle Bryce agreed, ushering his niece into the small room as the pastor had indicated. "If you will come with me, madam, I will see you to your seat at the front." "You must be so proud," the pastor said, playing the host to perfection. If he did know this was a sham marriage, he gave no indication at all. Aunt Jane simply grunted at the pastor, but followed in his excitable wake. A 20-yard passageway extended between the entrance to the church and the waiting room and the main nave. All the guests would have to pass it before they entered the church. Uncle Bryce shut the door firmly behind him and stood for a moment, looking at his niece. "Take a seat, he won't be long." "He could be as long as he wishes," Poppy spat back. "My father would be so ashamed of you for doing this." "Hush, child, I won't hear it even on a day like today," Uncle Bryce said with a sinister undertone to his voice. "Just be grateful for everything that I've done for you." They sat in silence for 10 minutes. Uncle Bryce moved his chair in front of the door. They heard the guests arriving and the pastor greeting them. Then they heard the unmistakable voice of Lucius Wolfe. "I'm looking forward to seeing my bride," he boomed. "It won't be long now," the pastor replied kindly. "If you'll come with me, I'll see you to your position." Uncle Bryce suddenly clutched at his stomach. He had overindulged rather too much on the whiskey last night in celebration. Now he felt a rumbling in the depths of his bowels. He knew perfectly well that he had to visit the necessary. As luck would have it, there was one just beyond this room. He had already spotted another small doorway that led to some kind of courtyard garden associated with the church, where a privy was conveniently situated. "I've got to go," Uncle Bryce told Poppy, holding his stomach as he made off at a run. "Wait here." "Of course," Poppy replied reassuringly. She knew that this would be her only chance, and she was surprised at how easy he had made it. She didn't move a muscle until Uncle Bryce entered the restroom and shut the door. She patiently counted out 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in her head. By this time, her uncle would surely have his pants down and be doing what nature demanded of him. She stood up and opened the door through which the pastor had guided them. Poppy glanced nervously up in the direction of the nave and saw the pastor chatting quietly with Lucius Wolfe at the front. All of the guests were facing the front. She took a deep breath. Without a moment's hesitation, she slipped out the door and ran. Chapter 10. Due to the layout of the city, it was actually quicker to run home than to take a carriage ride. Poppy ran down the tight lanes and alleys that connected the city. People stopped to stare. She didn't blame them. It wasn't every day in New York City that people saw a bride running through the streets. When she finally reached her aunt and uncle's house, she hammered immediately on the door. When Bessie didn't answer, she hammered on it again. Finally, the door opened, and Bessie looked stunned to see her. The anger had been mounting in her body the entire day. She could almost understand the actions of her aunt and uncle. They had never been close to her as a child. In fact, she could recall only ever seeing them once a year, at Christmas time. But Bessie had helped raise her through all of her 11 formative years. She had almost been like a second mother to her. But over a few short months, she turned. She had become just as wicked as Aunt Jane and Uncle Bryce. And now the anger boiled over. Poppy took a step towards her and slapped her square across the face. It was a satisfying moment. All of those beatings over the years were suddenly repaid with one single slap. After saying a few harsh words to the woman, she pushed past her and ran upstairs. She packed her bags quickly and then left without further ado. By now, they would know that she was missing, and the obvious first place they would come looking for her would be here. She had no intention of being here when they arrived. She now had to make her way to the station. She had already planned her route. She intended to be out in the open for as short a time as possible. She ran, not caring who looked. Speed was more important than stealth. This was a city of thousands of people. Yes, people might be interested for a moment in a bride running through the streets, but a few minutes later they would forget all about her and become self-absorbed in their own problems once more. The route took her past the newsstand run by Pat Connolly. He was there and looked equally as stunned to see her in a wedding dress as anybody. She paused briefly. "They tried to get me to marry one of my uncle's associates," she explained quickly. "I fled from the church. I'm going to Montana. Hunter wants me to marry him. I need you to do me a favor, Pat." "Of course, Miss Poppy. Do you need money?" Poppy quickly shook her head. "No, Pat. Keep your money. I have enough. No doubt, people will start asking questions about me. You could say that you saw a red-headed bride running through the streets of New York and direct them away from the station. Try and give me some extra time." He smiled. "Of course, anything, Miss Poppy. That's easy enough to do." Poppy bent down and kissed the old man on his cheek. "Thank you, Pat. Not just for that, but for everything. You've helped give me my freedom. I would never have thought of becoming a mail-order bride if it wasn't for you." The Irishman laughed as he watched the woman run away. A few minutes later, she was at the station. She was still wary. She expected her uncle to be there waiting to drag her, kicking and screaming, into a carriage. But he was not. She pulled out her coins. She had already put the money that Hunter had sent into the carpet bag together with her own. She knew she had more than sufficient for the ticket. Again, the stares followed as she marched along the length of the station. She didn't care. Let them look. Then, as the train finally began to leave New York City, the tears began to flow down her face. She didn't know why she was crying. Maybe it was with relief, or maybe they were tears of happiness. She wasn't sure. After 10 minutes, as the city began to disappear behind her, the tears stopped flowing. She began to pull herself together, and something else started to hit her. Excitement. She could feel it in the pit of her stomach. She quickly pulled down the blinds in her compartment. She thought herself fortunate that she managed to secure a compartment all to herself in which to travel on her own. That might not be the case for the whole journey, since there were at least 20 stops between here and Glendive. She quickly stripped herself out of the wedding dress and pulled on her usual church-going dress. It was far more suitable for travel and far less conspicuous. A part of her wanted to throw the wedding dress out of the window, but her more practical self knew it was valuable. She might even enjoy wearing it when she married Hunter. So instead, she folded it and managed to pack it in her carpet bag. She moved the pile of letters that she had carefully packed in the bag, and suddenly she froze in horror. She suddenly realized a mistake she had made. Last night in bed, she'd been reading Hunter's final letter to her, the one she had just received in which he had proposed. She had placed it carefully under her pillow, wanting to keep it close to her heart. It lay there still. She had forgotten to pack it with the rest of the letters in her rush to escape. The envelope would have Hunter's return address on it. Her aunt and uncle would find the letter and know precisely where she was heading. She sighed in frustration. She could have kicked herself for being so stupid. In an instant, all of her carefully laid plans were shredded. But then, as quickly as she panicked, the fear left her. It didn't matter. The next train for Montana wouldn't leave for a further 3 days. There was no quicker way to get out west. They wouldn't be able to beat her in a stagecoach. She and Hunter would marry almost immediately after she arrived. It wouldn't matter if her uncle did come looking for her. There would be nothing that he could do. She would already be a married woman. At least, that was Poppy Cooper's hope. Chapter 11. 30 hours after leaving New York City, the train pulled into Chicago. Poppy had spent almost the entire journey transfixed, looking out of the window. She had not spent considerable time outside of New York City. Watching the countryside pass by from the train window was nothing short of mesmerizing. She found herself unable to sleep, with adrenaline coursing through her body like nothing she'd ever experienced before. Considering the events of the past 24 hours, it was hardly surprising. There was a 2-hour stopover in Chicago, where Poppy had to change trains. She spent the time wisely, constructing a telegram to send to Hunter, accepting his proposal and informing him that she was already en route, and providing him with the details of when he should meet her at Glendive Station. She just hoped it would reach him in time. She also enjoyed her first hot meal since leaving New York City. She still had a reasonable amount of money left, and felt able to spend some of it on something to warm her insides. She wanted to ensure that when she arrived and Hunter saw her for the first time, he wouldn't cast his eyes on a scrawny mess. Before boarding her next train, she took the time to comb her hair, take a wash, and change into the dress she usually wore when meeting the guests brought to the house by her aunt and uncle. She had quickly decided to leave the new tight-fitting dress behind in New York, as it was highly unsuitable for life on a ranch. She knew that when she got to White Gates Ranch, one of her first jobs would probably be to make herself some dresses suitable for the wife of a rancher. She could hardly go about daily life wearing garments typically worn in New York society. But that was a problem to be faced when she got there. On the Chicago to St. Paul leg of the journey, she wasn't so fortunate with her seating. She had to share a compartment with 3 others. A grizzled old man who she thought was drinking from a bottle when he thought no one was looking, a young woman who looked suitably nervous and was probably younger than Poppy herself, and a jovial doctor around 40 years of age who tried to keep everybody engaged in conversation. However, as the young girl seemed too nervous to speak, and the grizzled old man was probably too drunk, most of the conversation was conducted between the doctor and herself. She found herself happy to share her story with a man she had never met before. He listened to her every word and offered suitable sympathies at the appropriate points. The young woman sitting opposite Poppy also listened, and she could see that her eyes grew wider as the horrors of Poppy's story emerged. "I'm also heading west to be a mail-order bride," the young woman finally blurted out. "My name is Jessica." "Pleased to meet you, Jessica," Poppy said. "I don't know if you caught my name at the start. It's Poppy. So where is your husband-to-be?" "Texas," Jessica replied. "I've got 7 days of travel ahead of me." "Goodness, and what does your husband-to-be do?" "He's a ranch hand. He calls himself a cowpoke. He works on a big ranch down there." Poppy was desperate to learn her story and to hear why she was fleeing Chicago. But as Jessica wasn't forthcoming, she decided not to press her. It might not be a story she wished to share. 8 hours later, they pulled into St. Paul. Everybody went their separate ways. The drunk didn't say a word to anyone, but the doctor wished both women well in their futures. Before saying goodbye, Poppy took the time to ensure that Jessica had sufficient money for the trip. Surprisingly, the young woman pulled out a huge wad of notes. "Oh, I think so," Jessica said. Poppy's eyes bulged. She had never seen so much money in her entire life. She wanted to know how the young woman had come by it, but she knew she could never ask. They said their goodbyes and disappeared to catch their respective trains. Poppy was supposed to wait 4 hours for hers, but it ended up being closer to 6. But in the scheme of things, it was nothing. She was about to embark on the longest leg of her journey. It would take 60 hours to reach Glendive. When she boarded the train once again, she found herself lucky. The train was all but empty, and once again she had an entire compartment to herself. This time she slept through much of the journey. The adrenaline had subsided, and Poppy felt nothing but exhaustion. She barely had the energy to get off the train at the various stops to purchase something to eat, but she managed it on occasion. However, there were other stops through which she had remained asleep. As a child, her mother had always told her that if her body told her to sleep, then she should. She remembered those words and decided to just get the rest. Suddenly, she realized as the train pulled off that Glendive would be the very next stop, probably in about 5 hours. A new feeling settled in her stomach. Along with the excitement, there were also nerves. During the journey, she had a terrible dream that Hunter Harrison was not the man he claimed to be in his letters. She feared that she would get off the train and, instead of the handsome young Hunter, she would encounter the old, vile Lucius Wolfe waiting for her. She prayed that the situation would never arise. Poppy spent the final few hours of the journey making herself look as presentable as possible. She wanted to make the perfect first impression on her husband-to-be. She looked out the window and watched the prairies roll by. She could see mountains in the distance and knew instantly how Hunter's letters had perfectly painted the Montana landscape. Maybe tonight they would watch their first sunset together. Then she felt the brakes begin to be applied to the train. This was it. They were arriving. There wasn't much to the station at Glendive. Much of it was basically hard, compacted earth. She also seemed to be the only one disembarking. She climbed carefully down and reached behind her to secure her carpet bag. Then she looked expectantly up and down the platform. To her horror, no one was there. Chapter 12. Hunter Harrison couldn't quite believe the range of problems he'd faced since his father had died. The old man had only been dead less than 12 months, and already Hunter had gone through the most significant drought in 20 years. A pack of wolves picking off his cattle every night, and ranch hands quitting and disappearing with some of his best horses. All of this led to a series of massive financial problems. He knew perfectly well that his money was quickly running out. The only bright point in his year had been the decision to place the advertisement for a mail-order bride. He'd done it at his father's insistence, wanting to grant the dying old man his last request. He wanted to see his son happily married. While that didn't happen, Hunter managed to tell him that he had placed an advertisement. His father went to his grave a happy man. Hunter highly doubted that anybody would bother replying to his advertisement, and he'd almost forgotten about it when Poppy's letter arrived. He found himself somehow bewitched by her letter. It painted a wonderful picture of her in his mind. As each letter arrived and he responded, he found himself falling under Poppy's spell. Now, months after receiving that initial correspondence, he had offered to take her hand in marriage. He was simply waiting for a response. He fully expected the answer to be yes, so much so that he had even included money in the letter to pay for her travel. Poppy had painted a terrible picture of her current living arrangements in their communications. The poor girl was being exploited by her aunt and uncle for their own financial gain. He highly doubted she would have the means to travel. He had to ride into town on a regular basis in order to collect his mail. The round trip took him the best part of 4 hours, so he only made the journey once a week. He simply couldn't spare the time away from the ranch. There was no shortage of jobs that needed doing. Cattle were always going missing. There were diseases to treat. Fences were broken, and horses were going lame. He now only had 2 ranch hands. One was an old-timer everyone called Bones. The other was a young boy of barely 18 by the name of Ben, whom Hunter managed to hire when meeting him in town by accident. He was a drifter, going from place to place, looking for somewhere to call home. The ranch wasn't a particularly large one, but Hunter had ambition. His father had often dreamed of owning the biggest and best ranch in Montana. Hunter wanted to make good on that dream. That was, of course, if he managed to make it to the end of the year. The way the problems were mounting up, that was somewhat doubtful. When he reached the town, he went to pick up his mail, hopeful of a communication from Poppy. Regretfully, there was no letter, just a series of new bills and demands for money. In an instant, his problems escalated once more. But then the man at the post office came running out after him. "Hunter, Hunter," he called. "I forgot this. A telegram came for you a few days ago." Hunter scanned it quickly, and immediately his face broke into a smile. "I'm getting a new wife." "Wait till you've been married a few years. You won't be celebrating then," the middle-aged man joked. Hunter read the letter again. "Wait, what's the date again?" the middle-aged man told him. "That's today," Hunter said, reading the telegram once more. "Have you seen the train leave?" "I think I heard it about an hour ago." Poor Poppy, she should have been waiting for him at the station, and nobody would have been there. He quickly called out his thanks to the man and turned his horse around. He galloped as quickly as he could to the station. When he arrived, he jumped off his horse and glanced around. There seemed to be no one there. He was an idiot. Why hadn't he come to check the mail sooner? She had probably wandered off somewhere in search of help. Goodness only knows what might have happened to her. He knew perfectly well that the saloon owner was less than scrupulous. What if she'd stumbled in there seeking help? He didn't want to think about it. But then, suddenly, out of the shadow of the wooden structure that served as a ticket office and waiting room, a woman emerged. He knew instantly it was Poppy. Her appearance matched everything she had said in her letter. She looked even more beautiful than the picture he'd summoned up in his own mind. "Poppy? Hunter?" "Yes, it's me. I'm so sorry I wasn't here to meet you. I've literally just received your telegram." He waved it as evidence. "It doesn't matter. You are here now," Poppy said, smiling. She walked slowly towards him. Their eyes suddenly locked, and Hunter picked her up and twirled her around. He knew instantly that he was in love. Chapter 13. Poppy thought that Hunter Harrison was the most handsome man she'd ever laid eyes on. He was even taller and more rugged than she had imagined. Her stomach flipped when she saw him, and when his eager eyes locked with hers, she immediately knew she had made the right choice. Hunter Harrison was everything he had described in his letters. When his hands touched her waist and effortlessly lifted her into the air, spinning her around, she couldn't help but giggle like a schoolgirl. For the first time in her adult life, she experienced love. "You're going to have to share the saddle with me," Hunter apologized. "If I'd known you were coming today, I'd have brought the cart. It would have made for a far more comfortable ride." Poppy didn't care. She was only glad to finally be there with the man she'd fallen in love with through his letters. She enjoyed the feeling of closeness as they rode out of the town and into the prairie. He guided the horse effortlessly with his right hand while his left arm circled her waist, ensuring she was secure on the saddle. She never thought for a moment that she might fall. He managed to stow her carpet bag in his panniers on the side of the horse. While they traveled, Hunter explained the ever-changing landscape as they moved further from the town toward Whitegate Ranch. She wasn't sure what she had envisioned when she thought of the ranch, but it probably wasn't this. It was a series of wooden buildings. The closest one, Hunter pointed out, was the ranch house where they would live, and another was the bunkhouse for the ranch hands. Separating the two was a large barn and stable complex. Hunter pointed around. "This is all the land that belongs to the ranch," he said. To Poppy, the place seemed huge, but Hunter assured her this was considered a small ranch in Montana. "But one day, it will be the biggest. My father wanted that, and I aim to make good on that promise," Hunter told Poppy proudly. "I'm sure you will," Poppy replied. "We can do it together," Hunter said. He lifted her down from the horse, and once again, Poppy felt that magical tingle run through her body. He retrieved her carpet bag and led her inside. It was nothing like her aunt and uncle's house in New York. The furnishings were basic, with no womanly touches, but she knew in an instant that this was a place she could call home. "This here is the spare bedroom," he pointed out. "This will be yours until we're married. I hope that suits you." Poppy nodded her head in agreement, pleased that a man would be so considerate. She knew she would soon have to explain the huge mistake she made when leaving New York City. She didn't want to appear forward, but she knew they would have to rush their marriage plans. "I'll let you get settled in, and I'll see about dinner." 10 minutes later, Poppy found him pottering around in the kitchen, wondering what on earth to cook. "I'm not sure what you'd like. I tend to live on bacon and beans," he told her. "That will do just great as my first meal out here in the West. But maybe long term you should leave the cooking arrangements to me?" "That would be wonderful," Hunter replied almost ecstatically. "It would be nice to eat something different occasionally. You'll get a different meal every day of the week. I promise you that," she said, but she allowed him to cook the bacon and beans that evening. They ate at the dining room table, and it was there, after they had finished eating, that she confessed to the mistake she made when leaving New York City. Her aunt and uncle would have her address. Hunter laughed. "Don't worry about it, Poppy. I'm happy to get married as soon as we physically can. Let's ride to town tomorrow and speak to the pastor. I'm sure he'll be able to arrange it without a problem." "It's not as if he has a big congregation." "That sounds wonderful. I just want to be sure that if they do come looking for me, there will be nothing on earth that they can do. If we are married already, then I'm going to be safe." "I doubt they will come looking, Poppy. As beautiful as you are, Lucian Wolfe does not sound like a man who would cope well in Montana." Once again, Poppy giggled. Hunter was right. There was no way that she could envision Lucian on a horse, riding through the prairie in an attempt to hunt her down. Maybe he was right. Maybe they would just leave her be. However, the question of the financial arrangements that were made between her uncle and Lucian still lingered. Maybe the sum was so significant that nobody could let the matter drop. She didn't express her concerns to Hunter. He seemed confident, and she wouldn't shatter that illusion at this point. Hopefully, tomorrow, the pastor would say that they could get married that very day. If not, there was still plenty of time before anyone following her could arrive here in Montana. She decided that she would relax. They drank coffee out on the porch and watched the sunset together, just as she had on the train. When darkness finally fell, there were tears in her eyes. But for the first time in as long as she could remember, they weren't tears of sadness, but tears of joy. Chapter 14. Poppy tossed and turned in bed. The sounds of the prairie were alien to her. At various points through the night, she was sure she'd heard coyotes laughing and wolves howling. She shivered and pulled the bed sheets closer. What would happen if the wild animals got inside the ranch house? Then she laughed. That almost certainly wouldn't happen. No doubt she would soon get used to it all. And she reasoned with herself that Hunter would probably feel the same if he had tried to sleep in New York City. However, that morning when Hunter asked her how she slept, she responded with a, "Yes, very soundly. Thank you." She didn't want the man to feel as though she was unsuited to life on a ranch. She wanted to make him proud. "One thing I'm going to need, Hunter, and I hate to start making demands as soon as I arrive, is material for a new dress. The garments I've got are most unsuitable." She spoke the words with a degree of hesitation, but she saw the way that Hunter had looked at her dress when he saw her that morning. Yes, it made her look beautiful, but it was hardly practical. "Of course," Hunter agreed with a smile. But inside, his heart sank. Fabric meant expense. At the moment, with the current situation, that was the last thing he needed. But he wasn't going to burden his bride-to-be with the ranch's problems at this stage. He would find a way to make everything all right, and then he would never have to tell her the position. They ate breakfast, and then Poppy followed him out to the stables. It was there she met the ranch hands for the first time. They were clearly not used to female company, and both shuffled their feet nervously and gave their greetings to the floor, as opposed to making eye contact. It was quite amusing to see both a young man and an old man behaving in precisely the same manner. "They'll get used to you," Hunter said as they rode away on their horses to fix the fence that had been damaged on the far side of the ranch. "I guess there aren't that many women out here," Poppy replied. "No, you can say that again. That's why we all have to seek brides back east. It seems that I'm the one that struck lucky, though." Poppy beamed at the compliment. "Shall we take the cart this time?" Hunter asked. "It'll be slower, but it will be far more comfortable." Poppy shook her head. No, it is quicker to ride as we did yesterday. Let's do that. I'd like this resolved as soon as possible. She paused for a second before adding, Sounds awfully formal, doesn't it? I don't mean it like that, but I hope you can understand why I want us to be married as soon as we can. Of course, Hunter said reassuringly. He looked down at her with kind eyes, and for a brief moment she was reminded of her father. When she was in his presence, she always seemed to feel secure. Hunter was just like that. She knew that he would always protect her. Let me run and grab something if you don't mind, just in case we can get married today, she said quickly. Of course. She grabbed the wedding dress that she'd carefully hung up in the wardrobe in her bedroom. But she also took with her the picture of her parents. If she was to be married today to a man she genuinely loved, she wanted to hold the picture of her parents close to her heart as she did it. It would make her feel as though they were part of the service. She put the items in her bag and ran back out. Hunter was waiting on his horse. He quickly dismounted and packed the bag in his saddlebag, as he had the day before. Before long, they were en route back to the town. Today, she felt a little more comfortable in the saddle. She learned to rise and fall with the terrain and the gait of the horse, and it was a lot more comfortable for her. Hunter offered her words of encouragement as she did so, and promised to teach her to ride on her own before too long. Poppy asked about life on the ranch and how business was conducted. Hunter answered as truthfully as he could. At various points, he almost mentioned the problems that the ranch was facing, but he decided this wasn't the moment. There would be time for all that in due course. This could be Poppy's wedding day. He wasn't going to spoil it with bad news. When they reached town, they headed straight for the manse, which was just to the rear of the simple wooden church that dominated the town square. Hunter walked confidently up to the door and knocked. The pastor's wife opened and seemed somewhat surprised to see Hunter standing there. Mr. Harrison, how are you, sir? How can I help? We'd like to see the pastor, if we may, ma'am. Poppy and I would like to get married as soon as possible. The pastor's wife smiled at Poppy, and then her face screwed up as she shook her head. It's not possible, I'm afraid, Mr. Harrison. My husband is ill. He's been sick for 2 days now, a fever. The doctor says he'll be okay, but it's going to take him a while to recover. Poppy's stomach felt tight, not from the news itself, but from the implications. She was sorry to hear of the pastor's sickness, of course, but she was concerned. By the time the man recovered and was well enough to conduct a wedding service, anyone pursuing her could well have already arrived. She exchanged glances with Hunter, and already the pair knew what the other was thinking. He nodded his head at her, acknowledging her concerns. Will you wish him well for us, ma'am? Hunter replied with sincerity. Would you be able to send word to us when he's well enough to conduct a wedding? Of course. The pastor's wife said with a smile. I want him out of the house as quickly as possible. She laughed, emphasizing that she was making a joke. They smiled in return. They left the woman to care for her husband. Hunter, what happens if the men come? She whispered, suddenly feeling very fearful. Hunter squeezed her hand. By the sound of it, it's not too serious. I'm sure the man will be up on his feet in a few days. He's a hardy sort, as you'll see when you meet him. But I've told you, I strongly doubt that anybody's going to be pursuing you. Poppy nodded in agreement, but deep down, she knew that that just wasn't going to be the case. As well as the financial arrangement that had been made with her uncle, she had a feeling that Lucian Wolfe was a man who wouldn't have taken the humiliation he endured at the altar very well at all. He would want his bride to be back, if only to teach her a lesson. She didn't think he would care what it cost either. Chapter 15. Before they returned to the ranch, they stopped off at the local mercantile, and Poppy purchased some fabric for her new dresses. Just put it on my account, Hunter said. It'll get settled at the end of the month. The owner simply nodded his head in agreement. Hunter knew he would have to worry about how to pay the account in a few weeks, but for now, it wasn't a problem. Hunter made a second stop just before they returned home. He quickly dismounted and headed inside the local saloon. He was inside for just 3 minutes before he returned. He was pleased to see she was still sitting upright in the saddle, and was not surrounded by unwanted attention from the locals. "I wasn't buying a drink or anything," Hunter assured Poppy. "There are a few men in there who hear everything that happens in town. I asked them to get a message to me if they hear of anybody turning up looking for a beautiful red-headed young woman from New York City." He gave her a little squeeze as he made the joke. She laughed, but secretly she was relieved. It would be good to get advance notice if anyone arrived looking for her. "We've got plenty of guns back at the ranch. I'm sure I know how to use one better than Mr. Wolf or your uncle," Hunter said, trying to reassure her further. As well as picking up the fabric, Poppy bought additional food supplies. She had a good look around Hunter's larder and saw that he was pretty much as good as his word. There was plenty of bacon and beans, but very little else. Hunter simply smiled as Poppy rang up further expenses. He would find a way to pay for it all, even if it meant having to sell some of the cattle at the end of the month. It would mean the income would suffer later in the year, but it would get them through the immediate short-term problem. It wasn't something that he wanted to do, of course. Ranches didn't grow by selling cattle, but by breeding and buying them. However, his stomach told him he would be glad to have a break from his standard fare for a short while. When they finally got back to the ranch, he explained to Poppy that he had to leave to help fix the fences. She assured him that she would be just fine. She knew perfectly well that any pursuers could not possibly arrive in Montana today. She spent the afternoon making herself at home. She completely rearranged the larder and determined the next thing she had to buy was a new set of cookware. Hunter's supply was somewhat limited, and that would reduce the number of meals she could cook. She then spent the rest of the afternoon making herself more suitable clothing. Remarkably, she discovered sewing equipment in the ranch house. Hunter explained that they had once been his mother's, and she felt honored that he'd allowed her to use them. By the time it came to cook dinner, she'd already made herself the basis of a brand new dress. Tomorrow, she would tidy up the hems, but worst-case scenario, she could wear it now. She'd always been good at needlework. It was one of the skills her mother had taught her when she wasn't at school. "One day, you'll need to cook and sew," her mother had always assured her. "These are skills that you'll have for life." Her mother was right, as always. Tonight, she determined that they would eat steak and mashed potatoes. It was a simple enough meal and didn't take her long to prepare. When she saw Hunter's horse appear in the far field, she threw the meat in the frying pan. By the time he'd reached the ranch house, his dinner was on the table. "I could get used to this," Hunter said, looking at the steaming pile of hot food on his plate. After a long afternoon repairing fences, the man was ravenous. She watched him with pleasure as he devoured the meal. She saw him looking over his shoulder in the hope that there might be more. She made a mental note to prepare more the next time. Ranchers obviously ate a lot. "Once I'm settled, I'll make some cakes. I've always been good at making cakes." Hunter's smile widened. "I can't remember the last time I had cake. Must have been when Mother was alive." "Tomorrow you will have some of my finest cake, good sir." They retired to the porch with big mugs of coffee and once again watched the sunset. Poppy was sure that she would never tire of this view. It was so different from a sunset in New York. Hunter once described in his letter that there was something magical about the place, and she could only agree. The mountains in the distance were like nothing she had ever seen before. She only wished she had discovered Montana and Hunter sooner, but there was something at the back of her mind that told her it all might be taken away from her. Chapter 16. Poppy slept better that night, but when she woke, she was already feeling nervous. She knew today was the day the train would arrive. It could bring her pursuers. She was relieved to hear that Hunter would not be repairing fences today. Instead, he and the ranch hands had work to do in the stables, repairing a leaking roof. She let out a huge sigh of relief. That meant all three of the men would be close at hand. She suspected that Hunter had planned it this way, knowing perfectly well when the train would arrive in town. He was half expecting trouble. She knew it. But if they hadn't received word by the end of the day that anyone was looking for her, They would be safe until the next train arrived a few days later. Poppy tried to put the matter out of her mind. Maybe Hunter was right. She had the vast majority of the correspondence with her. She had all the letters in which Hunter had explained that he lived on a small ranch that he ran in Montana. To the best of her uncle and Lucian's knowledge, the ranch could be huge, with hundreds of ranch hands working on it. Would they be brave enough to come up against 100 or more men? She doubted that very much. She clung to that hope as she continued making her new clothing. As lunchtime neared, she had finished 2 dresses and a new nightgown. It would keep her going in the near future. She started preparing lunch. For speed, she decided a hearty soup would be the best bet, despite the hot weather. She would get used to Hunter's tastes as she grew to know him better. She chopped up a range of vegetables and threw them into the pot. Before long, it was bubbling away. Suddenly, she saw the men scrambling down from the stable roof. Hunter ran across to the ranch house, and once indoors, he grabbed the firearms that were hanging over the mantelpiece. Both ranch hands ran for the bunkhouse to grab the weapons inside there. Instinctively, she knew something was wrong. The men converged in the yard outside. "Go inside and lock the door," Hunter demanded of Poppy. She peered out of the window with a panicked look on her face. This had to be it, she thought. But then she saw Hunter and the men relax. They lowered their firearms. A large man appeared on horseback. He didn't dismount, but it was clear that he knew Hunter. He bent down to talk to him, and Hunter nodded his head with a slightly worried expression on his face. Finally, the man turned and left. The 2 ranch hands took up position on the porch outside while Hunter knocked on the door. Poppy turned the key in the lock and opened it. "They're here, aren't they?" Hunter came inside and closed the door behind him. "It seems that somebody is here. 3 men arrived in town. 2 are described as being somewhat thick-set and brutish. The other one is a small, thin man, wearing a thick suit and carrying a briefcase. I think there was also talk of spectacles." Poppy shook her head. "That doesn't sound like either my uncle or Lucian Wolfe. There is no way that Lucian could possibly be described as a thin man." "Well, that's what I thought from what you were saying. So the question arises, who is this man? From the way my friend was talking, it seemed that the 2 men accompanying him were simply hired hands, protectors, if you will. What if he's coming to drag me back to New York? What if that's what these 2 men are for? Well, I rather fear that we will find out in due course. They managed to pay somebody in the saloon to give them directions to the ranch. I have no doubt they will be here sometime this afternoon. But there's something in my gut that tells me this has absolutely nothing to do with Lucian Wolfe. Is there anything else you think it could be?" Poppy thought for a moment. "There's only one thing it possibly could be, but I have no real idea. Percenteth." She went on to explain how she believed her aunt and uncle had been taking the money that had been provided by her parents for her care and spending it on themselves. As she had now reached her 21st birthday, she assumed that the money would stop. Anything remaining should probably go to her or her husband if she was married. She explained her theory that her uncle might have struck a deal with Lucian Wolfe, that he could have the young pretty girl in exchange for a substantial portion of that inheritance. She also went on to tell Hunter that even though this was her idea, she had little concern for the money. Her only thought had been to escape New York and not have to marry that vile old man. "It seems like a plausible explanation," Hunter replied to Poppy, "but we will need to be very wary." "You're not going to leave me here, are you?" Poppy demanded. "No. I have no doubt that these men will make an appearance here this afternoon, and the 2 boys and I will be waiting." "I don't care about the money, Hunter. I just don't want to have to return to New York." Hunter smiled at her and reached out and hugged her. "Don't worry, Poppy. You aren't going anywhere." It turned out that they didn't have to wait too long. After serving up soup for the 3 men on the porch, Poppy paced the ranch house relentlessly. She wanted this over and done with. She'd already decided that if Lucian Wolfe's men were coming to retrieve her, she would go with them. There was no way she could possibly allow the men to inflict harm on Hunter. She heard a rustle of activity on the porch, and Hunter and the two men immediately stood to attention. They had seen something. They raised their weapons as three men arrived in the yard. They were exactly as described. Two large men and a small man carrying a briefcase. She couldn't hear the conversation that was going on, but the two large men remained on their horses, making no attempt to draw their firearms. Only the small, bespectacled man in the middle seemed to speak. Finally, Hunter nodded his head, and the man dismounted clumsily. He could clearly ride a horse, but had not done so in quite a while. He clutched his backside as he walked towards Hunter, trying to rub some life back into his nether regions. Poppy was too concerned about the business this man might be on to find the situation at all amusing. She would normally see the funny side, but not today. Hunter opened the door and walked inside. "Poppy, this is Mr. Sampson from New York City." "Poppy Cooper, my goodness, you do look like your mother," Mr. Sampson said warmly. "Do I know you?" Poppy asked, somewhat apprehensively. "No, miss, you do not. I am, however, your lawyer, appointed by your parents. As I say, you do look remarkably like your mother. She was one of the most remarkable women I ever cast eyes on." He paused for a moment. "Maybe we could have this conversation around the dining room table." Poppy glanced at Hunter, who nodded his head. He gave her a reassuring smile, telling her that everything would be all right. Half an hour later, Hunter's assumption had been proved correct. Amidst a lot of complex legal jargon, it seemed that Poppy's hunch had been correct. Her father's businesses had never been anywhere near bankrupt. Nothing had to be sold off to pay creditors. All the business concerns were highly profitable. Her aunt had lied to her face about that. In fact, they were so profitable as to provide a constant source of income as Poppy grew up. That income was meant to be for Poppy's care and protection. But of course, it was paid directly to her aunt and uncle, her appointed legal guardians, up until the age of 21. Now that she had reached that age, she would be the sole heir to their estate. Her uncle's guardianship and the payments to him would cease. Of course, if Poppy were married, her husband would assume all financial responsibility. But she was not. Her hunch had been right. Her uncle had made some manner of backhanded deal with Lucian Wolfe, the specifics of which were unclear. She asked how Mr. Sampson had managed to find her so quickly. He smiled. "I rather suspected that your uncle would have some devious scheme up his sleeve. I always knew him to be a despicable individual. I actually objected to him and your aunt being appointed as guardians, but there was no other family, so there was little your parents could do. As you approached your 21st birthday, I had men follow you. Regretfully, I saw that you didn't get out of the house much, only going to the post office and back. I rather suspected that your aunt and uncle restricted your movements. Then I noticed the frequent visits by a certain Mr. Lucian Wolfe, and I feared that the plan was being put in place by your uncle. We also know one other thing. The only person you seemed to speak to was a newspaper vendor by the name of Mr. Patrick Connolly. After your sudden disappearance, I had a word with Mr. Connolly. I explained my business and that I had information that would be beneficial to you. In fact, I had to give him rather more information than I should have done. He told me that he last saw you heading away from the train station." Poppy smiled as Mr. Sampson told his tale. Pat had not let her down. "Finally, after numerous assurances, Mr. Connolly led on where you were headed. I got on the next available train, and here I am. Poppy Cooper, I'm pleased to tell you that as of the day I left New York City, you have inherited the sum of $127,429.57. Poppy gasped and clutched her chest. Hunter's eyes widened in shock. "Can you say that again?" Poppy asked. Mr. Sampson repeated the number in a calm, even tone. "That's a fortune." "Yes, Miss Poppy, it is. I also understand from my inquiries around town today that you plan to marry Mr. Harrison here. Is that correct?" "I do, as soon as the pastor is well enough. In fact, if he hadn't been sick yesterday, we would have been married already." Mr. Sampson nodded. "Well, I'm pleased to tell you the pastor is actually very well. He made a miraculous recovery overnight. We called on him because we knew that you visited there yesterday." Poppy shook her head. This strange little man seemed to know everything about her. "Are you entering into this marriage of your own free will, Miss Poppy?" Mr. Sampson inquired. "Of course I am." Then I see no problem with the provisions in the will. You are now the recipient of this small fortune. Well, after you sign these papers. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out what seemed to be a remarkably substantial ream of papers. But she guessed that was typical of lawyers. He then went on to explain that his colleagues in his law firm back in New York City were, even as they spoke, in contact with her aunt and uncle and Mr. Lucian Wolfe. Neither Poppy nor Hunter understood the majority of what he was saying. What they did take away from it was that the lawyers would threaten all three of them with legal suits if they made any attempt to pursue Poppy. In short, she was safe. She could marry Hunter, and she was now exceedingly wealthy. She would never have to think about New York City again. Oh, I almost forgot. The pastor said that he would be pleased to conduct the service at 11 tomorrow morning. Poppy squealed in excitement and ran into Hunter's arms. They would finally be married. Epilogue. Hunter had politely offered Mr. Sampson and his associates accommodations at the ranch, but they had declined. Hunter was sure they had far more comfortable lodgings in town, and he didn't blame them in the slightest for declining his invitation. However, they did agree to witness the wedding service the next day. The next morning, Poppy rose early and cooked breakfast for Hunter. She guessed the strange rule about not seeing the bride on the wedding day did not apply in this case. Should a woman as beautiful and wealthy as you really be cooking breakfast? Hunter laughed as he sat down at the dining table. I don't think we want a housekeeper interrupting our honeymoon bliss, do we? She replied, suddenly thinking about Bessie in New York. Hunter shook his head and turned solemn. Listen, before we travel to town, there's something I must tell you. I don't want to marry you, knowing that you have so much money, and then drop this news on you. What do you mean? Poppy said, turning to him. Drop what news? I didn't tell you before because I didn't want to worry you, but the ranch is in trouble. Since my father died, we've been faced with so many problems. He went on to list them all. Poppy nodded wisely, as though she understood the implications. Now that you're a wealthy woman, I don't want you to think I'm simply marrying you for your money. I'm giving you the option to go elsewhere. Poppy shook her head. She reached out and touched Hunter's hand. Why would I want to go and marry somebody else? It doesn't matter if the ranch is failing. The money I have access to can put things right. Put them right? We won't need all of that. We'll be back on our feet with less than $1,000. Then what on earth are you worrying about? Whatever I have is yours, or at least it will be when this day is over. I just wanted you to know that you had the option. I wanted you to know what you were getting into. That's very kind. The financial implications don't worry me. As long as I have you, I have everything. 2 hours later, they were leaving for town. Hunter actually broke down in tears when she emerged in her wedding dress. This time, they were taking the cart. There was no way she could mount Hunter's horse while wearing her dress. She ensured that she had her parents' photograph tucked discreetly close to her chest. While she was getting ready, she said a few words of thanks to them for the provisions they made for her. It seemed they hadn't forgotten her. But how she wished they could be there to see this day. She knew perfectly well that they would approve of her choice of husband, and she hoped they would be proud of what she'd become. The service in the church was relatively brief. The pastor, while back on his feet, was certainly not in the best of health. But Poppy couldn't wait to become Mrs. Harrison, and she wasn't going to delay again. She said her vows with a huge smile on her face. She was glad that Mr. Sampson was there to witness it. The fact that he knew her parents made it a little more special for her. As they left the church and said farewell to the lawyer, he assured Poppy that he would be in touch with all the necessary particulars in due course. He also offered a final reassurance that neither her uncle nor Lucian Wolfe would ever appear in Montana. That night, Poppy remained in her wedding dress while they sat on the porch of the ranch and watched the sun go down for the first time as a married couple. They sat close, holding hands as they watched the sun disappear over the horizon. Then, as the darkness grew, she turned to her husband and kissed him for the first time. The feeling was like nothing she had experienced before, and she wished they could remain like this forever.